6 habits that keep your mind young. After 50, Carl Jung psychology. Carl Jung observed that the second half of life is not a slow decline from the first, but a completely different country, with its own laws, its own weather, its own tasks, and most people arrive there still carrying a map drawn for somewhere else. Here is the premise, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further. Jung wrote in one of his essays on the stages of life, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." That is from Collected Works Volume 8, paragraph 784. And Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see what this means? It means the very habits that built your competence, your reputation, your identity in the first half, are not neutral in the second half. They are not simply old friends who've earned their keep. Some of them have quietly become the lie. And a mind stays young, not by holding the old program tighter, but by noticing when the program has expired. So let me speak to you plainly for a moment. If you are past 50, and something in you feels dimmer than it should, duller, more repetitive, like you are reading the same page of your life over and over, you are not broken, and you are not alone in this. Jung saw this so often in his consulting room that he gave it a name, the neurosis of the afternoon, not because anything is wrong with you, but because something in you is waiting to be recognized, and recognized is different from repaired. Here is my 3-part reflection before we begin. I say first, I have been running a program that was written for a younger version of me. I say second, I am willing to ask what in my life is still true and what has quietly become a lie. I say third, and this is the heart of it, say it with me, I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. Before we go on, let this reach you tomorrow too, if that is something you want. A small nudge to subscribe costs you nothing, and keeps the next teaching finding you. If something in what I just said landed somewhere quiet in you, type the words "face it" in the comments. Just those 2 words. Let it be a small marker that you heard it. The first key is, notice which hour your habits think it is. Jung taught that most people over 50 are still keeping office hours set by a 25-year-old. The same ambitions, the same need to prove, the same fear of being thought lazy or irrelevant. And a mind kept on that old clock grows brittle, not because it is aging, but because it is straining to be somewhere it no longer is. Think about how this actually looks in a single ordinary week. Imagine a man who spent 30 years building a reputation as the reliable one, the one who never says no, the one the whole office learned to lean on, and now at 55, he says yes to everything still. Exhausted, resentful, wondering why his mind feels so tired all the time. Why even rest does not feel like rest. It is not age doing this to him. It is a schedule that never got updated. A program written for a younger man, still running quietly in the background of an older one. Notice how this shows up in small places too. The way he still checks his phone at 11 at night out of old habit. The way he still feels a flash of panic if he is not the first to answer an email. The way he still measures his worth by how needed he is. Watch him on an ordinary Sunday, the one day meant for nothing, and see him still making lists, still rehearsing Monday, still unable to simply sit in a chair without a task nearby. That restlessness is not virtue. It is a clock stuck at 9 in the morning while the actual day has moved on, without telling him. None of this was foolish when he was 30. It built the very life he now stands inside. But a habit that once built something can, unnoticed, start to hollow the same thing out. And here is the part worth sitting with longer. The body keeps the old schedule even when the calendar has changed. The shoulders still brace for a meeting that is not coming. The mind still drafts replies to emails no one is waiting on. This is the quiet trap Jung pointed to. The very competence that carried you through the morning can become, in the afternoon, the lie that keeps you from living it. A mind stays young when it is willing to ask, gently, without drama or self-accusation, is this still true for me? Or is this something I keep doing only because I once needed to? That single question, asked honestly, on an ordinary Tuesday, over coffee, in traffic, before answering one more message you did not need to answer tonight, is enough to begin loosening a program decades old. Ask it again, on a slow Sunday afternoon, when the old restlessness rises for no real reason. And notice how often the honest answer is simply, "This was true once, and it no longer is." The habit of checking the hour, of asking what time of life it actually is, this is the first and gentlest discipline, and it opens onto something less gentle. Because once you ask what time it is, you have to ask what you were avoiding by staying so busy in the morning. I keep asking what hour my life is actually in. The second key is, loosen the mask you have worn the longest. Jung called this the persona, the face negotiated with the world, the professional, the parent, the provider, the capable one. And he was careful to say, the persona itself is not the problem. Every person needs a mask to move through a workplace, a family gathering, a world full of strangers who cannot be shown the whole of you at once. The trouble begins with identification, when a person forgets the mask was ever put on and starts to believe the mask is the whole of who they are. Jung wrote that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. And he warned that a person can wear an artificial personality so long and so well that they mistake it for their actual face. Imagine a professor who has spent 40 years being the authority in the room, the one with the answers, and slowly the textbook and the man become impossible to separate. At home, at dinner, even alone, he cannot stop lecturing, cannot stop being right, because the mask has fused to the skin beneath it. This is not arrogance in the way people assume. It is closer to a kind of forgetting, a forgetting of the face that existed before the title ever did. And here is the part that matters most after 50. The moment that mask is finally set down, at retirement, at a diagnosis, at the quiet emptying of a house once full of children, something underneath is supposed to step forward. And for many people nothing does, because nothing was ever kept alive back there. Imagine a woman who spent decades as the strong one in her family, the one everyone called when things fell apart. And at 58, with the children grown and the crises quieter, she finds herself strangely lost, not relieved, lost. Because the mask had become the only face she recognized in the mirror. This is not weakness. This is the mask finally being seen for what it always was, a useful arrangement, never an identity. So here is a small practice worth trying this week. Notice the moment you walk in your own front door and the title falls away, the parent voice, the manager voice, the reliable one voice, and ask honestly what remains in that first quiet minute. Most people rush to fill it with a screen or a task before they have to find out. A mind stays young when it can sit in that minute a little longer, when it can set the mask down for an hour, a day, and ask who is underneath. That question is uncomfortable, and it should be, because the answer is rarely finished. It is still forming, still becoming. And that becoming, Jung said, is the whole task of the second half, coming to selfhood. That is the phrase from Collected Works 7, paragraph 266. Coming to selfhood, not staying who you had to be. This loosening of the mask does not leave you empty. It leaves you available to something that was waiting behind the role the entire time. And that something is what the next key begins to name. I set the mask down long enough to see what is under it. The third key is, and this is the long one, so let me take it slowly. The unlived life comes knocking, and a mind stays young by opening the door, rather than bracing against it. Jung noticed something remarkable in his patients past 40, past 50, past 60, the interests, talents, and impulses that were set aside in the first half of life for the sake of survival, career, family, respectability, do not simply vanish. They wait, and somewhere around midlife they begin to knock, sometimes as boredom, sometimes as a strange irritability with a life that looks fine on paper, sometimes as a longing for something you cannot name. First, consider what this knocking actually sounds like in an ordinary week. Imagine a man who wanted to paint as a young man, who was told, sensibly, that it would not pay the bills, who became an accountant instead, competent, respected, and at 53, he finds himself standing in an art supply aisle For no reason he can explain, buying nothing, just standing there. That is the unlived life, knocking politely. Second, consider what happens when the knock is ignored. Jung saw that the unlived life, refused long enough, does not go quiet. It goes underground. And from underground it can surface as flatness, as a kind of grey exhaustion no amount of rest fixes, as irritability toward people who are simply living more freely than you feel you are permitted to. This is not a moral failing, it is a psychic fact. The parts of you that never got to live still belong to you. Third, consider how patiently this knocking can be mistaken for something else entirely. A woman who once sang in choirs before children and work filled every hour finds herself at 56 oddly moved to tears by a song on the radio, and she calls it hormones, or tiredness, or nothing at all, when Jung would have called it recognition, the unlived voice recognizing an echo of itself and asking quietly to be let back in. Fourth, consider what it actually asks of you. Not that the accountant quit his job and become a painter, that is the fantasy version, and Jung was suspicious of fantasy solutions. Grand reversals are rarely the real medicine. What it asks is smaller and more honest. An hour on Saturday with paint, a class, a return to the thing itself without needing it to become a new identity, or a new career, or a new persona to perform. Fifth, let me walk you through an ordinary day the way this actually shows up. You wake at 6. You check messages before your feet hit the floor. You move through meetings that could have been emails. You come home too tired to do anything but scroll. You tell yourself, this is simply what 50 looks like now. But somewhere around 9 at night, in that quiet hour before sleep, a thought surfaces, faint, almost embarrassing. I used to love this, I used to want that, and you dismiss it because it seems impractical. And Jung would say that dismissal, repeated night after night, is exactly how a mind grows old before its time. Not from years, from refusal. Sixth, notice too how the knocking often arrives disguised as envy. You see a stranger doing the very thing you once loved and feel a small unexplained sting watching them. That sting is rarely about them at all. It is the unlived life recognizing its own reflection somewhere out in the world and aching at the distance between you and it. A mind stays young by treating that sting as a clue rather than a shame. Seventh, a mind stays young by treating that faint evening thought as information rather than nonsense. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real thing you set aside decades ago. Not to overhaul your life around it, only to ask honestly, is there room this week for even a small return to it? The unlived life is not a debt collector standing at the door with a ledger. It is closer to a homesick part of yourself, asking only to be visited, not rescued. And the visiting, however small, however brief, is enough to keep the door from turning into something that pounds instead of knocks. I let the parts of me that never got to live come knocking without turning them away. The fourth key is, make peace with the shadow you postponed. In the first half of life, there is rarely time for this. You are building, proving, surviving, and the unflattering parts of yourself, the envy, the anger, the laziness, the pettiness, get shoved into a back room because there is no time to deal with them. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in a person's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. That is from Collected Works 11, paragraph 131. And here is what matters for a mind after 50. The back room does not stay quiet forever. It collects interest. Every year you do not visit it, the debt grows heavier, and a mind that spends its later decades still guarding that door has less and less energy left over for anything resembling growth. Imagine a man who spent his whole career being the calm one, the reasonable one, never raising his voice, praised at every job for his even temper, and at 60, he finds himself snapping at strangers in traffic, at cashiers, at his own grown children, over nothing, a dropped fork, a slow line, a comment barely worth noticing. His wife says, "You are not yourself lately." And the strange truth Jung would offer here is that he is, for the first time in decades, exactly himself. The calm was never the whole picture, it was half a picture, held up by force, and the other half, the irritation, the old resentments never spoken, the anger at being the reliable one while others got to fall apart, has simply run out of room in the back of the house. This is not a personality change. This is the shadow, decades of postponed anger, finally too heavy for the back room to hold, and it rarely announces itself with drama. More often it leaks, small overreactions, a flash of contempt for someone doing exactly what you once wanted to do and never allowed yourself, a bitterness toward the younger and freer that seems to come from nowhere. Jung called this the shadow's ordinary weather, not a storm, a steady grey seeping in around the edges of an otherwise composed life. A mind stays young, not by continuing to deny that room exists, not by working harder to keep the door bolted, but by opening it on your own terms, deliberately, with what Jung called considerable moral effort, looking honestly at the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime being too busy or too proud to examine. This is not a confession booth, and it is not an invitation to punish yourself for what you find there. It is closer to an inventory, taken in private, with no one grading it. And the strange relief people describe is not that the shadow disappears, it does not, but that it stops running the show from underground. Once it is finally looked at in daylight, the habit is simple to name and hard to practice. When you catch yourself reacting more strongly than the situation warrants, snapping harder than a dropped fork deserves, pause and ask, what old room did that come from? Not to excuse it, only to recognize it, because a shadow recognized loses some of its grip, and a shadow ignored only tightens its hold with every passing year. I open the door on the room I postponed for decades. Here is a small thing before we go on to the deepest key. If the last one moved something in you, staying subscribed means tomorrow's teaching finds you the same way this one did. That is really all I ask. One quiet follow, so the next door does not stay closed for you. The fifth key is the deepest one, and I want to take it slowly, in several turns, because this is where the real work of a young mind after 50 actually lives. First, consider the question of meaning itself. Jung said something in a broadcast in 1959 that has outlived nearly everything else he said. Man cannot stand a meaningless life. And he meant this almost clinically, not poetically. He had watched patient after patient, comfortable, successful, safe, come to him, hollowed out by a life that technically worked and meant nothing. Imagine a retired executive, pension secure, health reasonable, days entirely his own. And yet, he wakes each morning with a low dread he cannot explain. He tells himself he should be grateful. He has everything he once worked for. And still by 10 in the morning he is restless. By 3 in the afternoon, he is irritable with no target for the irritation. By evening, he is simply tired, in a way sleep does not touch. This is not depression in the medical sense. And I want to be careful here. This is what Jung called the general neurosis of our age, the senselessness and aimlessness of a life with nothing left to reach toward. Notice that his problem is not scarcity, it is surplus. He has time, comfort, freedom, and none of it organizes itself into anything. A mind stays young when it has something worth reaching for, not a goal in the ambitious sense, not another achievement to add to the pile, but a thread of meaning that runs through an ordinary Tuesday and gives the hours a direction they would not otherwise have. Second, consider what Jung called the symbolic life. He did not mean religion in the church-going sense, though for some people it includes that. He meant a life connected to something larger than the daily transaction of tasks. A life where the ordinary carries a little more weight than its surface suggests. Where a garden is not just maintenance, but a small yearly relationship with growth and dying back and growth again. Where a grandchild is not just a duty on a Sunday, but a living thread stitching you to what continues after you are gone. Where a craft half-learned, an instrument picked up again after 30 years of silence, a friendship kept alive through nothing more than a weekly phone call, becomes a small ongoing conversation with something bigger than utility. Imagine a woman who took up her grandmother's language again at 60, not to master it, not to prove anything, simply to sit with the old sounds for an hour a week, and she told a friend it was the first thing in years that felt like it belonged to no one's schedule but her own. That is the symbolic life, small, unhurried, and quietly organizing. The mind that stays young is the mind still stitching, still finding the ordinary, charged with a bit more than its surface. Third, and this is the part people flinch from, so let us go into it, without flinching. Consider your relationship to your own mortality. Jung was unusually direct about this. He believed that a person who has not made some kind of peace with death carries an unconscious dread that leaks into everything, into anxiety, into rigidity, into a strange, fearful clinging to youth itself. Watch how this leaks in practice. The fear that will not name itself as fear of dying shows up instead as fear of change, fear of new technology, fear of being replaced, fear of a doctor's routine appointment. And none of these fears are really about the thing they claim to be about. They are the old unspoken dread, wearing a smaller, more manageable costume. And Jung noticed something almost paradoxical here, that the people who aged with the most vitality were not the ones who refused to think about death, but the ones willing to look at it steadily, to let it become part of the furniture of their thinking, rather than a locked door at the end of the hall they organize their whole house around avoiding. Imagine two people at 70. One has spent decades refusing to speak the word death, even in her own home, brittle with the effort of it, terrified of every new ache, treating each birthday like a small defeat, and the other has made a quiet, unmorbid peace with the fact of an ending, has perhaps even written down some wishes, spoken plainly with the people she loves, and moved on to living. And it is the second one, almost always, whose mind stays supple, curious, capable of real unguarded joy, because so much less of her energy is spent guarding a door that was never going to hold anyway. Jung himself, in his own old age, kept working, kept dreaming, kept writing, into his 80s, not because he was in denial of his mortality, but because he had built a working relationship with it. And that relationship freed, rather than frightened him. Now hold all three of these together for a moment. Meaning, the symbolic thread, and the honest glance at the road's end. They are not three separate assignments. They are one posture seen from three angles. A person reaching for meaning is already, quietly, making peace with an ending. Because you only reach for what matters when you sense that time is not infinite. A person stitching the ordinary into something larger is already living the symbolic life. Because the stitching only makes sense if there is a larger fabric it belongs to, and a person unafraid of the road's end finds meaning and symbol arriving almost on their own, because so much less energy is being spent in avoidance. So here is the fifth key in full, meaning to reach for, a symbolic thread to keep stitching, and an honest, unfrightened glance now and then toward the end of the road. 3 turns of the same practice, and none of it is achieved once and then finished. It is a posture you keep returning to on ordinary days, in ordinary hours, not a mountain summited once. A mind stays young the way a path stays walkable, by being walked, not by being paved once and left alone. I keep reaching for meaning. I keep stitching the ordinary into something larger. I do not flinch from the road's end. The 6th key is, let the center shift from the ego to something quieter and larger. Jung called this something the self, not the small daily self that manages appointments and opinions and the ledger of who owes whom an apology, but the deeper organizing center of the whole psyche, the thing that was already whole before the ego ever started keeping score. And he believed that individuation, the lifelong work of becoming who you actually are, slowly moves the center of gravity from the ego toward the self as a life goes on. This is a quiet mechanics, not a dramatic conversion. So let me walk you through how it actually looks in an ordinary week rather than in a sentence. Imagine an older woman who spent her whole life needing to be right in every argument. At the dinner table, in the office, even in the car, needing her opinions noticed and her version of events to win. And for decades, this need ran her days without her ever naming it. And then somewhere in her late 60s, she notices something odd. Her adult son says something at dinner she knows is factually wrong, and the old reflex rises in her, the familiar tightening in the chest that means correct him now, and she waits, just a breath, and finds, almost to her own surprise, that she does not need to win this one, not because she has gone soft, not because she no longer cares about truth, but because something underneath the need to be right has quietly settled. She can let the small inaccuracy pass and still feel entirely herself. This is not resignation. Jung would say, this is closer to arrival, the ego relaxing its grip because it is no longer the only thing holding the house up. Consider how differently this reads from mere aging. A person can grow older and simply grow more entrenched, more certain, more brittle in their opinions. That is the ego calcifying, not the self emerging. So the sign to watch for is not whether you argue less, it is whether the arguing costs you less, whether your peace no longer depends on the verdict. A mind stays young, strangely, by wanting less from the world's approval and more from its own honest unfolding. The tree does not stop growing at 50, it does not stop growing at 80, it simply stops needing to be the tallest one in the row. It keeps sending roots down into what is unseen and green up into what is visible, quietly, without an audience keeping tally. And that is the real marker of a mind that has not gone stale, not that it wins less, but that it needs to win less. I let the center of my life settle from the ego toward the self. Here is the whole picture. Notice which hour your habits think it is. Loosen the mask you have worn the longest. Let the unlived life knock without turning it away. Open the door on the shadow you postponed. Keep reaching for meaning and an honest peace with the road's end. Let the center shift from the ego to the self. And if you look closely, you will see these were never 6 separate habits at all. They were 6 turns of one single key. The willingness to keep becoming, rather than settling for having arrived. That is the whole of what Jung meant by individuation. Not a destination reached at some fixed age, but a road that stays walkable, exactly as long as you keep walking it. A mind does not stay young by refusing to grow older. It stays young by refusing to stop growing. And those are 2 entirely different things. One is a battle against time you cannot win. The other is a conversation with time you can keep having for as long as you are given. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I make the unconscious conscious. And if any part of this found you tonight, sitting somewhere quiet, wondering whether 50 or 60 or 70 is a closing door or an opening one, let it be the second. The road behind you was the morning. The road ahead is the afternoon. And the afternoon, Jung believed, has a significance every bit its own. So I will leave you with this, not as an answer, but as a question worth carrying with you. What would it look like this week, just this week, to live like the afternoon actually has its own light,